All right.
Now Sarah will tell us about scaffolding in scaffolding lessons using global scale of English. So Sarah, yeah, welcome.
All right. Hello, everyone, and good morning. If I fall asleep during this presentation, I'll ask Maria to kick to talk to everyone today. I'm calling in from Chicago, and I'm very excited to bring to you this presentation about scaffolding. What we're going to look at today is understanding how to work with our lessons to make sure that our students are supported to success from the very beginning of the lesson until the very end of the lesson. And the question about using scaffolding for me goes back to when I started to do teacher training and development. I would frequently work with my teachers, and one of the things I would ask in every lesson plan I saw is, how are you using scaffolding? Make sure that your students will be able to be successful in English by the time they get to the end of the lesson. And during one of my teacher training sessions, I had a teacher ask me this question, and she said, "Sarah, you're always asking me to make sure I'm including scaffolding in my lesson, but what is scaffolding?" And it made me stop for a minute and think about, what is scaffolding? It's a word I use all the time, and I feel like I know what it is when I see it, but I wasn't exactly sure how to explain it very simply to the teacher. So I ended up giving her a very long answer that was not very clear, and eventually she just stopped me and said, "It's okay. I'm going to go do my lesson plan now, and you tell me if I have good scaffolding." So it was a bit interesting to me to see that challenge. So I started to think about it, how to explain scaffolding in a very simple way so that I can begin to see it more consistently in the lesson plans that my teachers were doing. And I started to realize that scaffolding is a lot like riding a bicycle. When we're looking at scaffolding, we have our students, when they start off, maybe they have training wheels on their bicycle, and they have a lot of support and help that will allow them to complete that tasks without my assistance. As my students start to become more proficient at riding a bicycle, you'll take off those training wheels. You may be standing behind the bike and holding it. Maybe they're only going on a very small area or very small surface. But we're there to give our students some support and to give our children some help until finally they can go off and they can ride that bike without our assistance at all. So with scaffolding in an English lesson plan, it's very similar. We want to begin by making sure our students have the support they need, allow our students to move forward until they have some controlled support, until finally we get to a point where they can do this work without any assistance from us at all. So riding a bicycle is one thing, but teaching this in an English language lesson is very different. So I want to look at what scaffolding would mean inside of a lesson plan. And essentially, much like riding a bicycle, it's about making sure that we are supporting our students through every stage of the lesson they'll work with. For my examples today, I will specifically look at working with a speaking lesson plan. The scaffolding would be slightly different for a reading lesson plan or for a writing lesson plan. But the one consistent element is that we're slowly building from a lot of teacher support and a lot of teacher assistance to a point where our students are working on their own without any assistance from us. So, if I'm going to plan a lesson with scaffolding in mind, where do I need to start? And what are the things that I need to think about to make sure I'm going to successfully achieve a scaffolded lesson? And the first thing that we really want to look at is our learning goals. What is it that we want to do in our lesson plan with our students? This is going to give you a lot of information about how you work with scaffolding inside of your lesson plan. Now, it's very interesting when we talk about learning goals. In education, there are two different kinds of learning goals that you can work with. We have learning outcomes, which are more of a big picture goal. And then we have our learning objectives, which are our class by class goal. So for example, if you have a program at your school, and let's say it's a 6-week program for your students, the school will have defined some learning outcomes that by the end of 6 weeks, students should be able to do things if they've been successful in this classroom. This is very useful for helping to recruit students. It gives our students, our parents, anyone who works inside of that class, an idea of what it is we want to accomplish. This doesn't inform what I need to do every day inside of those 6 weeks to make sure that my students are successful. Those would be our learning objectives, and those are those day-to-day goals that we need to accomplish in order to make sure that our students are successful. So for our learning outcomes, this is, again, very big picture. It's going to describe the entire overall learning inside of the course. It helps our students understand what they will be able to achieve by the end of the course. And it helps us understand the progress goals that we have. Where do we expect students to be at the beginning when they start, and how much progress do we hope to see by the end of the course? This also gives us an understanding of what the final assessment of the course will look like, because with our learning outcomes, we understand how we can measure the achievement from before the students begin the course to the end of the course and our end learning goals. And then again, for our daily goals, this is where we get our student learning objectives. This gives me information about what I'm doing every single day inside of my classroom. My learning objectives are going to be what we call very granular. So for a course, my learning outcomes, I might only have 5 learning outcomes, but the learning objectives underneath that, I could have as many as 10 or 15 different learning objectives that I might use to build up to my learning outcomes for my course. The learning outcomes are going to help describe the types of lessons, and they'll help define the types of activities that I want to bring into a classroom in order to be successful with those objectives. They're also something that can be observed, and I think this is one of the most important things when we talk about working with learning objectives. Is it something that you can see or hear your students do in the classroom so that you have a measure of their success when they're working? This goes towards our formative assessment or towards the performance assessment that we might expect of learners inside of the classroom. The last piece with learning objectives, and this is another thing that makes these very different from learning outcomes, is that we can be responsive. I'll ask and you can answer in the chat box. Have you ever had a class where you went in and you were very confident your students would be able to be successful with a lesson, and at the end of your 45 minutes or your 50-minute session, you find yourself standing in the middle of class asking, what happened? None of the students were able to do the work that you brought in that day. The students were making mistakes that you thought you had corrected a few weeks ago with your lessons, and suddenly it seems like you had gone all the way back to the beginning with some of the work you're doing. I know that I've certainly had this experience myself. And what this tells us, it's very informative for us as teachers. At that point, we have to make a decision. Do I move on to the next lesson that I have planned inside of my syllabus, or do I need to take a moment and take a step backward and plan to do a new lesson on this learning objective to make sure that my students are prepared and ready to move on? So with student learning objectives, because these are class-by-class objectives and not the overall learning outcome, this gives us an opportunity to be responsive so that when our students are not performing to our expectations, or when our students are overperforming, they're clearly prepared for this content and ready to move actually quite further, we can be responsive to those needs in the classroom. By putting all of this together, we create our student learning objectives will slowly build up over the series of the course to become the student learning outcomes that we can measure with our assessments at the end of the course. And all of this works to help us understand scaffolding. It also leads us to the question of where do learning objectives come from? There are a couple of different sources that we can use to get our different learning objectives. One, they could be created by your school. It could be something that you as teachers work together to decide these are the objectives that we want our students to have. For many schools, they're defined in some way by the course books, the curriculum, or the material that we choose to use inside of our classrooms. For some, they're defined by the assessments. If we know that our students need to accomplish certain information in order to be successful on a test, we might be using very specific learning objectives. And then in some cases, they might be defined externally. For those of us who are working in institutions that have been accredited by an outside body, there is an expectation that we are in some way going to meet these learning outcomes that have been defined. So depending on your institution, they could come from several different places. I think many of us are probably familiar with working with learning objectives that use an external framework. My personal favorite external framework is the CEFR, which I'm sure some of you have heard of before. If not, it's the Common European Framework of Reference. And one of the things that I like about the CEFR is that it is a research-based set of objectives that help us define student performance. Along with the CEFR, I also like using the Global Scale of English, which aligns to the CEFR, but provides me with a bit more granular information about student performance. So for example, if I know that all of the students I'm working with are A2, but my students are a low A2, what does that look like? With the Global Scale of English, there are a set of objectives that are arranged on a scale, so I can say, well, it's an A230, and here are the learning objectives inside of an A230, or an A232, or an A235, and I can use those learning objectives to define my classroom. So it's a very useful tool for me. So here you can see, for example, if I have my course book, I've looked at my course book, I've looked at the different pages inside of my course book, I've looked at the learning objectives that happen on those pages, and because I have the CEFR and the Global Scale of English, I can see the level of difficulty. The level of difficulty is key for planning for scaffolding in your classroom. You have to understand what is going to be the most challenging for my learners in order to understand where you need to put the most scaffolding. And this is why learning objectives become so important. If we're constantly scaffolding every single piece of our lesson, our students are not going to make the kind of progress we want them to make because they won't have the challenge they need to be inspired to make progress against their learning. So we want to use our learning objectives to help us create scaffolding by understanding how difficult the content is that we're presenting and being able to provide the most appropriate support to the areas of our lessons that are going to be the most challenging. It's a lot of information about learning objectives, but the learning objectives help us understand the scaffolding. To give a little bit more insight into this, we're going to actually look at some lessons and see how those learning objectives can help us. And there's one more thing that we want to keep in mind with scaffolding in our lessons. When we're using activities to help us scaffold lessons and to help us scaffold the content that we're presenting to our students, we want to be sure that the activities that we use are thoughtful and that each of these activities builds towards our students being successful with the language that we want them to learn. So each step inside of our lesson plan is going to connect and support the next step that comes inside of our lesson. Our overall goal is not that we want to have lessons that have a lot of interesting activities or engaging activities. It's to create a lesson that has activities that really build towards success at the end. So I'm a teacher. I love pop quizzes, and I'm going to give you all a pop quiz right now. You can type your answers into the chat box. What I'm going to do is I have a lesson here. I have one lesson, and it's taught in two different ways. What I'd like you to do is to take a look at this lesson and the two different lessons, lesson A and lesson B, and I would like you to tell me which lesson has better scaffolding. So I have my lesson plan here, and on my lesson, you can see that I have my lesson objective, which is characteristics of personality. And I can see my level here is an A2+. I have lesson A and lesson B. I'll give you just a few moments inside of the chat box. I'm going to be reading what you're saying. Of these two lessons, which one has the better scaffolding, lesson A or lesson B? All right, I'm starting to see some answers here. My Russian is not very good, so if you're typing in Russian, I might have a little trouble here understanding. All right, I'm starting to see lots of different answers. I have a couple of B's, a couple of A's, and I will go through and explain the difference between these two lessons. All right, I'm starting to see lots and lots of B's, more B's than A's. All right, let's take a look at it together. So I see a lot of people saying lesson B, and a few people are saying lesson A. Let's look at lesson A. Of the two lessons, I can see very quickly, just by looking at the lessons, that lesson A has a larger number of activities inside of the lesson. But let's look at how those lessons build to support our student learning. First, we're talking about our students' family and personality. Then we're matching the word to the definition. In lesson A, we would write sentences. We have a crossword puzzle. We have a bingo activity. We have a toss ball activity. And then finally, our students write a story with the vocab. Now, this is different from lesson B. In lesson B, I introduce my vocabulary with a definition. Then I practice my vocabulary in a sentence. I'm using that vocabulary in a dialogue. And then from there, each activity following is some kind of dialogue activity, using the dialogue to describe my family members, finally describing one family member, and then finally a mingle to describe family members in different classrooms. Of these two activities, lesson B has the better scaffolding, and I'll explain to you why. One of the biggest differences between lesson A and lesson B is that in lesson A, my students start off talking about family personality, but I haven't introduced the vocabulary words for my students to work with. That comes as my second step, whereas in lesson B, I start off with an introduction of the vocabulary and the different definitions. So here, my students are going to be supported towards success because they're already learning the words that they need to use. And before they do any other activity inside of the classroom, I want to be sure they understand the vocabulary I need them to use in the lesson. The match activity, this is a vocabulary activity that we use for clarification. I love matching words to definitions because there are so many different ways we can do it. You can do it with a worksheet. You could do it with matching cards. You can do it as a picture game, depending on the kinds of materials that you have. It's a fantastic activity, but this is what we call a vocabulary clarification activity. If you look at the next activity in lesson A, writing sentences with the words, this is another vocabulary clarification activity. Again, it's very useful to make sure that our students understand the words and understand how to use the words, but it's about clarifying the meaning of the words. If you look at the crossword puzzle activity, this is an excellent activity to see if students can use the definition to guess the words. Again, this is a vocabulary clarification activity. So this activity is designed to make sure our students understand the different words that we've presented. This is also true of our personality bingo. Our students will be looking at pictures and they'll be clarifying that they understand the vocabulary by matching these different pictures to the language of personality characteristics that we introduced at the beginning of the lesson. It's developing our understanding of, do we understand these vocabulary words? And this toss ball activity, can you guess what kind of activity that is? This is also a vocabulary clarification activity. So in my lesson A, every activity that I've done so far in this lesson clarifies the vocabulary. In my final activity, I ask the students to use that vocabulary. What's happened here is I don't have any activities inside of lesson A that are supporting my students to use the vocabulary. I'm really focused on helping my students understand the vocabulary. This is very different from lesson B, where I have a lot of scaffolding. I start off with the word definition, and then we practice using those vocab words in a sentence out loud. This is my vocabulary clarification activity. From here, I move on to my first use activity, where my students use the vocabulary in a scripted dialogue. As you can see, my objective for the end of the lesson is that my students can do this classroom mingle activity. That's very important. That's what I want to get to. So as soon as I get into the third activity in my lesson, I'm already starting to use that vocabulary. I'm moving away from clarification and into use. Each activity after follows and builds on that use and gives my students more freedom. Here I have a scripted dialogue. In my next use activity, my students use the vocabulary and now they have a picture that they're going to use. They can use the scripted dialogue or they can be supported by a new dialogue that gives my students more freedom. By the time we get to describing the family member using the vocabulary, at this point there is no scripted dialogue. So in order for my students to use the vocabulary, they need to start internalizing that language and internalizing how to use those structures, which allows me to get to my final activity where my students can describe their family members with that classroom mingle. At this point in the lesson, because I've built every activity after my clarification activity for use, I can feel fairly confident that my students will be able to be successful in that mingle activity. So the purpose of the activities should always be driving towards my goal or my objective, and in this case that objective was use. Now, lesson A has lots of great vocabulary clarification activities, and I could easily borrow one of these clarification activities, like a crossword puzzle, I love crosswords, and use it instead of what I currently have, which is my vocab in the sentence. So I can bring in one of these clarification activities to my lesson to make it a little bit more exciting and interesting. But if we want to be sure that as we're moving through the lesson, we're not just having our students clarify, but actually getting towards use. And that's because in a well-scaffolded lesson, what we're always looking for here is that our students can actually, we want to make sure that our students have clear learning objectives and that every activity builds. So for example, in this speaking lesson, you can see we start with setting the foundation or presenting our language. We'll have our clarification activity to make sure our students can understand the language, and then we'll slowly move towards I don't know where those lines are coming from. It's very exciting. We'll slowly move towards our controlled practice, our freer practice, and then finally we get down here, which might be a little hard to see, our fluency activity, where our students can use that language without a lot of support from the teacher. We're going to move on. So I've been talking a lot, and it's going to be a little different. We're going to actually try this together, so feel free to comment in the chat box here. I want you to imagine that we're doing an online lesson together, and I'm going to go through this lesson as if I were the teacher. I'm going to move a little bit quickly. This is actually a 45-minute lesson, but I don't have 45 minutes worth of time. So we're just going to take a little bit of time, and I want you to imagine how you might teach this lesson with your students. All right, so I'm going to start off with, these are some of the words we're going to use today. And what I'd like you to do is, if you know the definition of the word, I would like you to just take a moment and type the word and the definition in the chat box. So for example, if I'm talking about a friend of mine and I think they're a little difficult, for me, difficult means hard to work with. So as you can see, I've typed my answer here into that chat box. So if you know the word and the definition, go ahead and type the word and the definition in the chat box. I'll give you just a moment. See who knows some of these words. Does if go ahead. Boring is dull. I agree. Extrovert, very sociable. It's a great way to describe extrovert. Students who always tell the truth, honest students. I like honest students in the classroom. So in my actual classroom, I would take a few more minutes with this, but we're going to go ahead and move on. I imagine at this point, we've had a chance to define all of the words together. And if there were words that we didn't have good definitions, I would take a moment to reteach that with my students. Now I'm going to move on to my next activity. Hopefully on the screen, there are some people that you might be a little bit familiar with. Here are those different characteristics of personality. For each of these students, I can probably make several sentences about their different characteristics. So for example, Harry Potter, I would say Harry Potter is, he's friendly. He's very friendly. He likes to make friends. He is also a little independent. So take a moment, if you can make some sentences. You can even use and if you want to use to. So again, Harry is friendly and independent is a sentence I could use. How would you describe some of these other characters? Ron is quiet. It's a great sentence. Hermione, she's one of my favorite characters. Very serious, very independent. Fred and George are very rebellious, I agree. So in my actual classroom, I would do this, if you're doing this in a live class, you can do this as a pair activity and have two students work together, and each student can take turns describing different characters from the story. You could also do this as a group activity. So again, first activity, which is, I've gone from my first activity, which is introducing the characteristics of personality, and my second activity, this is a very simple activity where my students will start to use those words to describe characters. Now, I want to just check and make sure we're all on the same page. So I have a little bit of a quiz here. And what I'd like you to do is to match the word with the definition. So if you know which word matches, number one, for example, is difficult, the definition that matches with difficult would be what? And go ahead and take a moment to type your answer in the chat box. All right, I see 1E, and I'll give you a check-in. I will give you a moment to go and type some more answers. So again, in the classroom, I've introduced the vocabulary to my students in that first word splash. In my second activity, I have my students work in pairs or groups to describe different characters from a story. Now I'm taking a quick moment to check in, and I will go ahead and check our answers together to see how we're doing. I think I'm seeing lots of correct answers here, so you can see this on the screen as well. All right. So in my next activity, I want to go a little bit further, and for this is a kind of game. I would explain how this would work in the classroom. I would have my students work in pairs, and student A would ask the question and student B would answer it. So for example, my student A says, "Who's that?" And I'm just going to randomly pick a person from this board, and I'm even going to close my eyes, and who do I have here? I have David. Okay, so I selected David. So, oh, that's David. And student says, "Oh, you know David?" And I can say, "Yes, he is friendly and independent." "Are you good friends?" "No, not really." "What about you? Who's that?" And we can now take turns, change roles. So we can use this to describe some different stories. So I'll ask you in the chat box, can you pick someone at random and describe their characteristics of personality? I'll start it off. Who's that? Just pick someone and just let's describe who they are. That's Zoe. All right. Do you know Zoe? Tammy is strict. That's good to know. Ellie is an extrovert. I like it. What about Zoe? See if we can look at Pam is rebellious. Excellent. So again, in my lesson plan with my actual students, I can put this up on the screen, or I could have this as a handout or a worksheet for my learners, and I would have my students do this as a pair or a group activity. Because the selection here is random, and because my students have to use the words, we're now getting into a lot more internalization with that vocabulary. And again, this is another chance to practice using the vocabulary in a dialogue. Now I'm going to move on to my next activity. And here, what I want my students, I'll give everyone a few minutes to think about family members and draw a picture of family members. There are a couple of variations on this that you can do. If my students have cell phones in the classroom, I actually have them pull up a picture of a family member or a friend on their phone. So we've had a lot of fun doing that. We can also do this on tablets in the classroom. So imagine in the classroom, you give everyone a chance to collect a picture or an image of a friend. And then finally, in our final activity, which we won't be able to work through, I would have my students work in partners to describe the picture of their family or friends. This would go for about 5 minutes. And finally, my final activity would be a mingle activity where I have everyone stand up, go around and meet other students and describe the different family members or friends from either their drawing or from a picture that they've brought to class, or a picture on their phone or their tablet. Now, in this lesson, every single piece is very carefully scaffolded to get to my learning objective. I know that at the beginning of my lesson, my goal, again, is to get my students to use these vocabulary words. This is to help clarify those words. This is to check their understanding. But this dialogue activity sets up my next dialogue activity, which builds to my next dialogue activity, which builds to my final speaking dialogue activity, which builds to our final activity in the classroom. So the scaffolding here is to really support my students in using these words as we move through the lesson. And it's all about the lesson. It's all about balancing out the lesson that I'm working on with my students. As you can see here, I know that this is my learning objective, that my students will be able to use characteristics of personality to describe family members. I know that my students are an A2+, so this objective is perfectly at the level of my students. This is my target language, and I looked up all of this target language, and I found that all of this target language is around A2+ on the CEFR and also on the GSE. So it's also right at the level of my students. Now, I want to challenge my students. If I'm only teaching my students at the level, we're really just practicing that information. So I think about I+1, or I think about that proximal development, making sure there's just enough challenge to push my students. So I've selected some vocabulary here, and you can see the GSE and the CEFR value. If my students are A2+, B1+ vocabulary will be very difficult to my students. So in my lesson plan, I need to scaffold all of the vocabulary. If you think back to the lesson plan, you'll note that as we started, everything was focused on the vocabulary, but the grammar item for my lesson plan is a very simple, present simple. I don't have to teach the grammar because that's at the student level. In the same way that I'm not going to spend too much time on speaking in a pair dialogue because I know my students will be able to do that. And that's all about the level of difficulty. If I know that my vocabulary is difficult, I want to scaffold that vocabulary, and I want to make sure that my grammar and my skill are very simple. If my skill is very difficult, I want to make sure that my grammar and my vocabulary are a little bit easier. And whoops. I don't know where I went. If my grammar is very difficult, I want to make sure my vocabulary and my skill are very easy. So when we're thinking about scaffolding, this is really what we want to do with our students, and we want to make sure that they have access to that information in a way that we can support them and build them to their needs. To get to my learning objectives today, if you're interested in how I got all of these learning objectives or how I checked the level of difficulty, I use english.com/GSE. It is a website where you can see all of the CEFR objectives and the global scale of English objectives aligned to the CEFR. And there's even this handy little teacher toolkit that allows you to search and to look up different objectives in your lesson plans. So I know that today it's a very early morning, and I wanted to take some time to make sure to go through in detail. I don't know if we have any time left for questions.
Actually, we have got around like 2-3 minutes for the questions. And there has been some. Yes, sir. Sir, if you could look at the questions and pick up, I don't know, sir, pick one or two which you like.
Okay.
So like from moderator, yeah.
I haven't been following, so I don't know. It's not very clear from the team who does what lesson A. So for pair work for lesson A and B, that's something you assign in the classroom. So I would have student A, B, A, B, A, B. It's an assignment choice that you need to make inside of the classroom. For the scaffolding, the logic is really going from accuracy to fluency. We do want to start off by building at the beginning of our lessons to make sure our students have accurate information about either our grammar structure or the vocabulary that we're using. And then as we build through the lesson, we want to give them opportunities to use that information that we presented in the beginning. So a lot of this lesson today, again, I was using a speaking lesson. This is about building from very, very slowly from our understanding of the definition of the vocabulary word to the point where I can actually use that vocabulary word. If you take a look actually on English.com blog, I do have notes from this lesson, including the complete lesson plan that you can read through. So if you'd like to see a very in-depth analysis of that lesson plan and how we're building in the scaffolding, if you go to english.com/blog, you can read the scaffolding blog that goes along with this. It'll be very, very helpful.
Thank you, Sarah, very much. I'm afraid so we have run out of time. You are such a hero today. You've gotten up so early. You know, now it's like quite an evening in Russia, in Moscow. I guess more later in in Paris.
I have lots of coffee.
Gosh, lots of coffee. Okay, so thank you very much for such a dynamic presentation. So you see a lot of thank you from their side, from my side. Okay, if you want, you may take part in the rest of the conference, or you may just go to bed just to catch up with me.
I might go take a nap. And I put this back over to presenters. Yes, for you?
Yes. No, I'm gonna say goodbye to you, and I will make you a participant too. Okay. Bye bye.
All right. Bye bye, everyone. Thank you.